So this book started out actually as part of my dissertation at the University of Chicago, and it was my original conception to try and connect Rus into a much larger medieval European world. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to identify a few key areas that would demonstrate that connectivity. And so I focused on, first of all, deconstructing this idea of a Byzantine commonwealth, which is often used, and we can talk more about that later, dynastic marriages, which then became the subject of ties of kinship as well, religious interactions, and trade as another type of interaction. And each of these areas could have gone on to become a whole book or maybe been several books in their own right. But I wanted to deploy a strategy of saying, look, Rus is connected to the rest of medieval Europe. Look at this broad array of ways they're connected and put that argument out there. And that was the goal of Reimagining Europe. It was trying to challenge the current status quo about the interpretation of where Rus fits into Europe, both in terms of medieval European scholarship, but also Eastern European scholarship that fit it into silos of Russian history or Ukrainian history. And I'm saying, yes, I guess it goes in all of those things, except I want it to be looking at this horizontal strata of medieval European history. I think there are a lot of things we could blame. I like to blame the Enlightenment. I think the Enlightenment had a lot to do with it, and I think these ideas of tracing what we think of as Western civilization, and I teach world history here at Wittenberg, and I often will critique Western civilization as the classes on Western civilization progress from Greece to Rome to France and England, and the Enlightenment, and then eventually the culmination of Western achievement, America, right? And this is this progression of Western civilization. And part of that is the writing about the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire absorbed the Greek ideas about democracy, and they began a republic, and those ideas then became passed on, and often the Middle Ages is kind of skipped over as that dark period. And then we get into France and England, and we talk about the Magna Carta, and we talk about the Estates General and Parliament as the rebirth, the renaissance of those ideas from Rome. However, when you do that and when you construct that narrative through time, Rome becomes a key point in that narrative. And left out of the Roman Empire, of course, is not just Scandinavia, which seems to not miss out on this, but all of Eastern Europe, or at least a good chunk of Eastern Europe. And so that's not included in this narrative. We also get a competing problem of nation building in the 18th and 19th century, where Khrushchevsky, we see this a little bit with his history of Kyivan Rus, but the Russians certainly do this even more so, are trying to construct their own autochthonous idea of national identity. And so, for instance, the idea that the Varangians, the Vikings, were the ones who created the first communities in Eastern Europe that are known as Rus, that is going to be not true, right? So this is what's called the anti-Normanist position, that they weren't Northmen, that the Rus were Slavs of some kind. When in fact the Povest Vremniklet says quite clearly that the Rus were Varangians, just like the Gotlanders are Varangians, or the Normans are Varangians, or the Swedes are Varangians. Right? It lists them clearly among other groups that we identify as Scandinavians. But it's part of an idea of creating a sense of self, of us for us. Right? And this is a big thing in the 18th and 19th century in particular, is creating that national identity. So I think there are multiple different reasons that we get the creation of separate narratives for this. And certainly the Cold War doesn't help. And we're going to see the rise in America in particular of area study centers and the growth of these particular funding mandates for study in X. Right? They're interested in studying Russia, not because Russia is so interesting, but because we may need to fight it someday. So one of the big narratives that does incorporate Rus is this idea, first posited by Dmitry Obolensky, who is, in fact, one of these descendants of the Rurikids that we were talking about earlier. Obolensky talked about an idea that Byzantium led a commonwealth of states. And he included in this commonwealth Rus and southeastern Europe in particular. These were areas that were influenced by Byzantium, whether they knew it or not. And this became a very persuasive idea with the publication of his book in the 1970s, such that the majority of Western medievalists know this book and this idea, and they've imbibed it. And what it has allowed them is to say, yes, medieval Europe is this one thing. It is England and France and the papacy and maybe a little bit more than that, because Byzantium has its own thing, right? It has its own rival Eastern European commonwealth. However, one of the things I talked about, and I'm certainly not the only one to critique Obolensky's idea, Anthony Kaldelis has done so. He's a Byzantinist in very clear language. But Obolensky ignored a lot of the primary source evidence that didn't seem to fit his model. And so what I tried to do was construct a slightly different model that had a nod to Obolensky's Commonwealth, because he was a very eminent scholar. And I talked about the Byzantine ideal. And this is what the first chapter of Reimagining Europe is called, as the Byzantine ideal. In this, I say that Byzantium is Rome. It is, in fact, the Roman Empire, and this is the way it's known in many primary sources from medieval European history. And it is the example of empire par excellence. So if you are a state in medieval Europe that is trying to establish itself and you want some increased authority or grandeur or honor of some kind, you want to appropriate some of that Romanitas, that Romanness, for yourself. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can take Roman titles, imperator or basileus, and we see Charlemagne, of course, quite famously in 800 be crowned Imperator Romanorum, trying to take this title. Offa of Mercia, about the same time in Anglo-Saxon England, calls himself Basileus Anglorum, using this Greek word Basileus to say that he is king of the Angles. In fact, what he really means is emperor of the Angles, but he never gets this imperial title in English. You can take art and architecture, which we'll see most famously under Otto II and his wife Theophano. But you can also do this through marriages, and you can see marriages that happen with the Byzantine Empire as a way to connect themselves, connect these new states in the rest of Europe to Rome, to Byzantium. And the most famous example of this, of course, is the marriage of Anna Porphyrogenita. In the end of the 10th century, Anna, who was the daughter of an emperor and sister to two others, was probably the most eligible bachelorette in all of Europe, to put it in modern terms. She brought with her a connection to Byzantium. She was born in the purple, which made her especially noble and imperial. And three different rulers in medieval Europe were contesting for her hand. We have evidence that the Capetians of France were trying to get her to marry one of their line, that the Ottonians of the German Empire were trying to get her to marry into their line, and that Vladimir of Rus was trying to get her to marry himself. And in fact, it was Vladimir, or Volodymyr, who ends up winning this contest, in part because of very realpolitik considerations. He is able to offer her brother Basil II military aid at a particularly important time for Basil, and thus he secures Anna's hand for himself. And so he gathers for himself this Romanitas, which both the French and the Germans had wanted for themselves. That's right, and then this is part of you becoming a real, quote-unquote, kingdom or empire, because you have some of this connection to Byzantium, to Rome. Yes, so that's a good conversation to have. So Rome, at the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian splits Rome into two halves, and so there are two halves to the Roman Empire. And more famous than Diocletian even then, of course, is Constantine, who in the early 4th century reunites those Roman empires, but also founds the city of Constantinople on the old village of Byzantium. Pardon me. And so Constantine founds this new city as a new Rome already in the 4th century, and Constantinople becomes his capital that he rules from. So even though this is still the time when, even in the West, we call this the Roman Empire, Constantine is ruling from Constantinople. So that is already the capital of the empire. So when the city of Rome falls to the barbarians in 476, and the last emperor in the west, Romulus Augustulus, is usurped. All of the regalia, all of the imperial trappings are sent to Emperor Zeno in the east. He's in Constantinople, and he becomes the sole, once again, Roman emperor. There aren't an east and a west. Now there's just one Roman emperor, and that Roman emperor is at Constantinople. There are many cities that talk about themselves as a new Rome or even a new Jerusalem. We see that language as well. The Russians, much later in time, will try and use this language of Moscow as the third Rome, as a way to very, like we were talking about a moment ago, self-consciously appropriate the grandeur of Rome for themselves. And it's just a different way of appropriating that. So one of the other connections that grows out of this conversation we were just having about orthodoxy, you were saying, one of the other big debates that seems to separate off Rus from the rest of Europe is, well, they're Orthodox, or they were converted by Byzantium, and thus they're different, they're separate. And in fact, what I try and challenge in Reimagining Europe is this idea of religious separation. And so one of the larger, and I think more interesting chapters in Reimagining Europe is about religion, and I try and showcase all of these areas where Rus is still religiously connected to the rest of Europe. Because at the time, there is an idea that you're Christian, I'm Christian, you're Orthodox, I'm Latin, we're all Christian together, and that's okay. There is a idea that in 1054 there is a split in the churches because of what sometimes is known as the Great Schism. But this split, this mutual excommunication, is papered over and healed over very quickly after. And that's the part that often gets left out. And because we often like to pinpoint big dates in history so that we can draw these connective lines, 1054 is used as a way to say, oh, here is the split between the Orthodox and the Latin worlds. Done. Over. But in fact, that's not the case. We see multiple instances of connection between the church in Rus and the rest of medieval Europe at this time, in the 11th, in the 12th centuries. In fact, beginning with Volodymyr, when Volodymyr receives Anna Porphyrogenita from Constantinople, he wants to be baptized. And in fact, he is baptized. But he's baptized by the bishops of Kherson, this city in the Crimea that he had seized as a little bit of a lever to release Anna from her brother. And so he chooses who baptizes him. This isn't priests or bishops coming with Anna. This is the bishop of Kherson. And that he is the baptizer of the people of Kiev. And the Prof. Reimagining tells us that he does it very gently, driving them down to the Dnieper in the winter and dunking them in the river. But he is the agent of conversion. He is choosing this. So this isn't Byzantium actively going out and converting him, right? He is making those decisions. And in fact, some of the chronicles tell us that, in fact, the papacy sent messengers to Volodymyr at this time trying to woo him and in giving him relics as presents. And so there are these papal Rusian ties throughout the 11th and 12th century that indicate there are still connections going on. And in fact, one of the biggest connections comes during the investiture controversy. In the end of the 11th century, there's a struggle going on between church and state in our modern terms. The Gregorian reforms led by Pope Gregory VII are trying to get rid of lay investiture, where nobles can in fact make their own churchmen. They can name someone a bishop or name someone an archbishop. And Pope Gregory says the only people who can name bishops is me, right, or my archbishops. And so Henry IV, the emperor of the German Empire, and Gregory VII get into a big fight about this. Now, Henry IV is excommunicated. I mean, there's all kinds of problems. But into this steps Rus. And Rus gets involved in this for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is because Henry IV, in his bid to defeat the Pope, creates his own Pope, Pope Clement III, or as we typically call him, anti-Pope Clement III. And Clement III wants to recruit as many Christians as he can. And so he writes a letter to the Metropolitan of Kiev, Kyivan Rus, saying that very thing, right? You should come and be a part of my community. I'm the real pope, all of these sorts of things. And Henry IV thinks this will work. And he thinks this will work because Henry IV has dealings with the rulers, the Volodymyrovichi of Rus. And in fact, he has already arranged a marriage with Yevpraksia Vsevolodovna. So he already has political ties with Rus, and they've demonstrated no problems. What he doesn't know is that the Metropolitan, Kyivan II, is a Byzantine who doesn't even speak a Slavic language, probably, and in fact is still in his head in Constantinople. So he gets this letter from Clement III, and he reacts as a Byzantine would react. No, of course you're not the true ruler. The only true ecclesiastical ruler is the Patriarch in Constantinople. Don't even bother talking to me about this again. If you have any further communication, send it to the Patriarch in Constantinople. So there's a real disconnect between what the political players are saying and what this religious player are saying. But nonetheless, Henry IV will end up marrying the Rusian princess Yevpraksia Vsevolodovna. And they are married until Yevpraksia leaves him. And she leaves him under very important circumstances. She leaves him not because of anything he did in particular, but she leaves him to go side with the papacy against him. So she goes and sides with Gregory VII's successor, Pope Urban II, and she begins then speaking out all over Europe against her husband, Henry IV. And so this Rusian princess, Yevpraksia, goes on a speaking tour to talk to bishops all over Europe and tell them how horrible Henry IV was. And she uses all of this prepared dialogue. But the sources tell us Yevpraksia said, Yevpraksia spoke. So we see this Rusian princess speaking all over Europe and telling horrible stories about Henry IV and how the Pope is the best guy ever and he's the true leader who should win this battle. And in fact, she speaks in 1095 at the Papal Council at Piacenza, which is seen as the real turning point in this battle where Henry IV loses and Urban II wins, and Yevpraksia is there for that moment, and she's a big part of this. And so she is this Rusian princess who is doing all of this. And after 1095, her position is minimized here, and she returns to Rus. But here's the really important part that seals the whole story. Yevpraksia returns to Rus, and she isn't viewed as an outsider. She's not viewed as betraying orthodoxy. In fact, she becomes a nun a few years later, only after Henry IV, her husband, has died, right? And I think that's important, that the two of them continue to honor their marriage, even though they were living apart. She becomes a nun after Henry IV dies, and at her death, she gets one of the most prestigious burials available in Rus in the 12th century. She's buried in the Kievan Caves Monastery. She gets her own chapel erected there, and she gets more lines in the chronicle for any woman other than Olga, right? The Princess Olga, the wise. Right? So she's honored for her service. And so what I read into all of this is that there is no ecclesiastical divide that affects the political realm. Yevpraksia was serving her natal family, her birth family, while she was in the rest of Europe doing all of this. And she was honored for all of that work she did when she returned home, not condemned for being part of this Latin world or for having, helped the Pope. So there is, in fact, no real ecclesiastical divide, probably until the 13th century. The problem is the vast majority of people who learn medieval history are going to learn it in schools, and they're going to learn it in their secondary schools if they have maybe a good secondary school, or they're going to learn it in college if they take a medieval history course. And those medieval history courses, by and large, are going to focus on Western Europe. They're going to focus on England and France. The Vikings are going to be seen as the attackers who come in and sack England and France. Maybe we'll hear a little bit about the Reconquista and the Crusades and the Mediterranean world, but typically Eastern Europe is going to be left out. And the real goal, and the real goal of all of my work, but Reimagining Europe in particular, is to try and rewrite that narrative and to encourage Western medievalists to look at Eastern Europe and to try and integrate Eastern Europe into the stories that they're telling. And this is why I focused on that investiture controversy story, because the investiture controversy you'll find in every textbook on medieval Europe. Yevpraksia appears in almost no textbooks on medieval Europe. Even though she's Henry IV's wife, even though she speaks at the Papal Council of Piacenza, she just doesn't appear. She's not a part of the story for them. But in fact, she and Rus are part of that story. And so that's one easy entree that Rus could have into those textbooks. Right? And I offer some more in Reimagining Europe, other ways that Rus can be seen right alongside these other stories that are told about England, about France, about Spain, about the German Empire, and Rus could be included very easily alongside those. And so these textbook writers could build a larger picture of medieval Europe rather easily and include Rus. And if they do include Rus in medieval Europe, then medieval Europe gets much larger, because then it becomes odd to include Rus, and then you're leaving out Poland and Hungary, right? And then you have to start looking at the great work that's being done by Nora Berend and others to include Hungary and to include Poland, and then you begin building this larger image of medieval Europe. And then if we can take it a couple steps down the road, if you're learning medieval Europe in school, and medieval Europe is all of Europe, and then you're looking at what's going on in Europe today, why are these divisions today? What is the political basis for these divisions? If you start out with a base that Europe is all of Europe, then you wonder why these divisions happen. However, what we've done is we've created a world where there's a divided Europe, an iron curtain that penetrates not just dividing Europe, but penetrates through time and goes back to medieval Europe. But if we can get rid of that iron curtain, and we can look at Europe as an entirety, then we can really reimagine what Europe means, not just in the 11th century, but we can look at that in the 20th and 21st century as well. Writing the trade chapter, the chapter on trade, was something I didn't do for the dissertation, but I did for the book, largely at the request of Richard Helley, who was my advisor at the University of Chicago, who also worked a lot on trade himself. And the data on trade is immense, and I only barely scratched the surface of the secondary literature and some of the archaeological materials. Rus is so deeply connected into the trading systems of not just Scandinavia and Western Europe, but Byzantium and Eurasia more broadly as well. And I think that would be incredibly fruitful for someone to look at and study all of those trading patterns, because that would allow us to talk not just about a medieval Europe that's much broader, but Western Eurasia as a broader set of trading connections too. Because goods are coming in from Central Asia, goods are coming in from the Middle East, goods are going out to those same places as much as they are going out on the Baltic, on the Black Sea, or the land routes that go through Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, the German Empire. And so that was really new to me. And I liked that a lot. And I don't work particularly in trade or economic history, but I think that could be a very fruitful place of endeavor. Understudied. I think we have a lot of basic stuff on it. It's in the primary sources, and archaeologists are doing tremendous work digging up and cataloging all of this. It's really historians who are falling down, because there aren't very many of us in looking at that, synthesizing it, and writing about what it means. The archaeologists are great at finding it, and they're great at cataloging it, and they're great about saying, I found this in this place, which is what they need to do. I think then we need either a different kind of archaeologist or a historian to come in and say, okay, well, what that shows is this much broader pattern of trade and engagement. Well, and even in American academia, medieval history and history in general are under siege, simply because there is not much funding to go around. And the purpose of American academia, as far as administrators are concerned, is providing jobs and job training. And so pre-professional programs are getting the majority of funding, while the humanities and social sciences are really becoming increasingly underfunded. And it's very short-sighted, but there's also a trend to defund medieval and ancient history as not relevant or not necessary. And so that's something that we're dealing with. I would encourage them to look at the year 1000 or the year 1050, when there was no Russian-Polish conflict. And that's one of the lessons that I always find people surprised at when I teach about it, is the Rus and the Poles used to get along great. They used to be allied and intermarried and cooperate. And I think if we can look at that period as a model and not forget, but try and move past some of the horrors of the last 800 plus years, I think that there's a way that those groups could work together much more profitably than they can be antagonistic towards one another, and not just use the past as a tool to isolate themselves, but use the past as a way to talk about being more interconnected. I think that this is a readable book, or I'd like to think that this is a readable book. This is that somebody who is not necessarily an expert in medieval history or an expert in Ukrainian history could pick up and they could read this book and they could learn something about the medieval world. This is a book that is written for specialists, but I think is readable by non-specialists as well. And so I encourage people to pick it up and read it and try and find out something about this old world interconnectivity that we've been talking about today.